So for a couple of years, I've been deeply immersed in the study of the work of one Carl Jung, firstly through Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and then through Peterson, and then on into what eventually became the practice of psychotherapy, and then the extracts from Psychology and Alchemy that are found in Dreams, which is from part 2 of Psychology and Alchemy on the mandala symbolism. And as I was drawn into it, I was obviously also studying the work of Viveki Schmachtenberger, Jordan Hall, and getting these downloads about the meta crisis and meaning crisis, and trying to do a deep diagnosis and prescription. And for a long time now, I've felt very much weighed down, stuck underneath this mountain of material. And in many ways, I feel that Jung is a kind of villain. And it's a little hard to explain what I mean by that, but I have a sense that he has that quality. I'll read a quote to illustrate this from the beginning of part 4 in Dreams. Which is individual dream symbolism in relation to alchemy. As I said, from Psychology and Alchemy. It's a Latin quote from Virgil, which in translation goes, "Easy is the descent to Avernus. Night and day the door of gloomy Dis stands open, but to recall thy steps and pass out to the upper air. This is the task, this the toil." And so Mount Avernus is believed to be the entrance to the underworld in Virgil. It's also the name of a volcanic crater near Cumae in Italy. And within that crater is Lake Avernus. And according to tradition, all birds flying over the lake were destined to fall dead, hence its name. Its name was translated or transferred into the Greek as a birdless lake. And this was likely due to toxic fumes that the mouths of the crater gave off into the atmosphere. And there also lie the remains of temples to Apollo and Jupiter at this place in Italy. And so, as he said, easy is the descent to Avernus. It's easy to go down into the depths. Then he said, night and day the door of gloomy Dis stands open. What is Dis? Dis is the ruler of the underworld, or hell in Roman mythology, and in the Aeneid, in Virgil. Does not appear in person in the Aeneid, but the underworld is described as his domain. Has no direct Greek parallel. And so anyway, the night and day, easy is the descent to Avernus. Night and day the door of gloomy Dis stands open, but to recall thy steps and pass out to the upper air, this is the task and this the toil. And this is very much the atmosphere in Jung. It's heavy, Saturnian. And I feel that very strongly at the moment. And so my way to extricate myself from this labyrinth is through I'm I've felt for a long time that I wasn't ready for Jung, and so I held off on the Red Book, which I now have the task of analyzing. And this is why I've spent so much time on psychological types and the Red Book already, is because they form the nexus of Jung's whole maze of theorizing. Anyway, I need to analyze Jung. I need to get underneath and find something to leverage in order to find some space. And, don't get me wrong, I'm slowly going through Robert Avon's The New Gnosis of other people like Thomas Chetham, slowly discovering Corbin, Gregory Shaw, as well as Vervaeke. There's other people, Buber, who are not to mention Heidegger, who offer a different perspective. And so I've come to focus particularly, and I know that I'm being abstract and I'm not really, I'm showing rather than telling the deep impact that this has had. And it becomes a huge commitment that will take many years to resolve. And for me, I found that understanding a relationship with Christianity is something that I'm opening to. In my own way. Also to the Islamic Sufism through Corbin. But I'm really stuck between paganism and Christianity. And Jung, unfortunately, makes sense. And hence the time that I've spent with his ideas and the influence that they've had. Can't escape the sense that he makes. But I've come to feel that if I understand his relationship with Christianity in greater depth and detail and understand how he positions himself spiritually, I believe that can help me. And so I've been studying Mary Stein's Jung on Christianity, which are a selection of Jung's writings on the topic. And I've gone through a great chunk of the book so far. And some of the parts that remain are Jung's childhood experiences in relation to his father and in relation to the Christian faith that he was raised among. And so I'm going to take a look at that. It's a section called A Father's Unfinished Work. And it's extracted from part 1 of the book, which is called Jung's Relationship to Christianity, and it's originally published in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is his autobiography. And so I might also, before then, read one of the experiences that you named in the introduction. Sorry, it was Murray Stein that named it, but that was, I think, in episode 11 in this series. But yeah, so I'll just read the paragraph. The essence of the religious life is for Jung religious experience, not piety or correct belief or faithfulness to tradition. To understand specifically what he means by this term, religious experience, it's helpful to note 3 paradigmatic instances of it described in his writings. The first of these is an experience from his own childhood. He reports in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that as a schoolboy in Basel, he had a, quote, religious experience that remained with him for the rest of his life. It happened that one fine summer's day, as he came out of school and stood in the courtyard in front of the impressive Basel Cathedral, he entertained an image of God sitting on his throne high above the scene before him. The twin towers and checkered tile roof of the cathedral were bathed in brilliant sunlight. It is a massive brick structure, and on that day it seemed to him exceptionally solid and weighty. Jung's maternal grandfather had been the pastor of this fortress of Swiss Reformed Protestantism, and the boy must have felt some pleasure in recognizing a degree of kinship to God Almighty himself. Suddenly, however, he had an unexpected urge to unleash a blasphemous fantasy. Given the majestic sanctity of the mighty cathedral before him and its solemn, somewhat threatening, towering presence, this so frightened him that he ran home and consciously suppressed the fantasy with all his might. For 3 days he struggled against a looming thought that would not be denied. Finally, he could no longer resist it, and with fear and trembling, he let himself return mentally to the scene of the cathedral. Once again, he stood in the courtyard and looked up to the heavens, where the Almighty God sat on his golden throne. With a courageous gesture, he released his impertinent mind, and the following sequence of images welled up in him. A trapdoor opened underneath God's throne, and a gigantic turd fell down and smashed the cathedral to bits. When all was said and done, he did not feel guilty, but rather experienced a rush of relief and grace. A big thought had been released in his mind. Perhaps more remarkable than this fantasy itself is Jung's way of understanding it. For him, this kind of explosive outburst of unexpected, unwelcome, and unconventional mental content, image, and thought became a touchstone for the authenticity of religious experience. The experience of God is the experience of being overwhelmed, terrorized, and even humiliated by his awful and contrary will. In religious experience, Jung postulates, one's conscious mind is usurped by a superior inner force and becomes possessed by alien images and thoughts from the unconscious. Responsibility for this, both for the phenomenon of the mind's state of possession and for the unconscious contents that flow into it, belongs to God, that, quote, overwhelming psychic factor. God is the force behind the unconscious images that break their way through the ego's defenses and inundate the conscious mind. Jung testifies eloquently to the Protestant sense of the individual's direct, unmediated experience of the divine. And so we notice already, first and foremost, that this is a very particular regard for God, experienced in a certain way that in Jung's life would come to very much shape his understanding of God, right? And seem to foreclose the reality of other people's experiences. In some way, I have to be more careful. What I mean is that when Jung experienced God in that way, it seemed to shape for him an understanding of, obviously, it shaped his understanding of God. But I'm saying that it has a particular character, and many other people have many other experiences that are of a transcendent or mystical, transformative nature that are very different in character. So the sheer diversity of experiences of God, what's called God, seems important to me to note. I would then say that there is a collective quality to the psyche that Jung himself pointed out. And I feel that when images, visions like the one that he describes appear to people, that they're of a far more collective nature than we tend to notice, or that we tend to regard them as being. And so, that cathedral that he had a vision of is sort of, it's very much taken in a sense literally to be the church. And I think for me, I notice how not only does it have the sort of, I'm talking about the sort of symbolic lattice work of meaning that surround an image like that. And so for me, and of course it may simply be my interpretation, and that's fine with me, I think this is obvious, is that the cathedral in this case is a symbol of the Western spiritual canon, the superstructure, the inheritance, the legacy. And to me, that cathedral is very much it's the backbone of civilization itself. And so, it's the sacred canopy. And so there's a way that when through what we could describe as quite Freudian natural process, that apparently originates with God in the vision, causing a quote rush of relief and grace. There's a way that it's not just the cathedral that is being destroyed, it's obviously, right? It's what the cathedral represents. And that's a shame. It's a big shame because it's a beautiful cathedral. And so there's a way that I feel that kind of experience is it's a starting point, right? And I would say in my experience, I've felt deeply betrayed by the institutions such as they are, that cathedral sort of represents. So that the smashing of the cathedral by the quite gigantic turd feels to me, um, yeah, that's I get that. I get what that means. And it's not exactly something to celebrate. It's more like very unfortunate context from which there's no going back. And I simply wanted to draw out here that it's not just the cathedral, it's the whole edifice. It's actually the entirety of civilization. And I'm not saying that that is what was apparent to Jung. There's a way that these images they have and they express a collective meaning that yeah, I just I feel that such images they occur to people and we often make a very personal and literal meaning out of them. And it's not exactly that that's wrong. It's that there are other layers of interpretation that may also be true or validly noticed. And I don't know when I noticed that about when I was thinking about this rather significant dream of his religious experience, formative religious experience. It's like, wow, that's just a very particular place to begin from that really shaped his mission and his approach, as far as I can tell. And so with that as an addition, I'm going to begin with this section that I wanted to get to. We'll see if I find anything to say for myself. It's called A Father's Unfinished Work from MDR pp 52 to 63. Quote, with my father, it was quite difficult. I would have liked to lay my religious difficulties before him and ask him for advice, but I did not do so because it seemed to me that I knew in advance what he would be obliged to reply, out of respect for his office. How right I was in this assumption was demonstrated to me soon afterwards. My father personally gave me instruction for confirmation. It bored me to death. One day I was leafing through the catechism, hoping to find something besides this sentimental sounding and usually incomprehensible, as well as uninteresting, ex expatiations on Lord Jesus. I came across the paragraph on the Trinity. Here was something that challenged my interest. A oneness which was simultaneously a threeness. This was a problem that fascinated me because of its inner contradiction. I waited longingly for the moment when we would reach this question, but when we got that far, my father said, we now come to the Trinity, but we'll skip that, for I really understand nothing of it myself. I admired my father's honesty, but on the other hand, I was profoundly disappointed and said to myself, there we have it. They know nothing about it and don't give it a thought. Then how can I talk about my secret? I made vain tentative attempts with, I think it's not quite clear what he means by his secret in that context. Is he referring to such experience as I described earlier, or to his experience of there being two voices within himself? It's not clear. Anyway, but importantly, he felt that he had a secret. Quote, I made vain tentative attempts with certain of my schoolfellows who struck me as reflective. I awakened no response, but on the contrary, a stupefaction that warned me off. In spite of the boredom, I made every effort to believe without understanding, an attitude which seemed to correspond with my father's. and was prepared myself for communion, on which I had set my last hopes. This was, I thought, merely a memorial meal, a kind of anniversary celebration for Lord Jesus, who had died 1890 minus 30 equals 1860 years ago. But still, he had let fall certain hints, such as, quote, "Take, eat, this is my body," meaning that we should eat the communion bread as if it were his body, which after all had originally been flesh. So again, this is already a metaphorical or literal understanding of the meaning of the communion, in the sense that there are very much believing Christians who feel that the act of the communion and the eating of the bread is quite literally the body of Christ, not as if it is his body. Anyway, obviously that was not obvious to Jung. Likewise, we were to drink the wine which had originally been blood. It was clear to me that in this fashion we were to incorporate him into ourselves. This seemed to me so preposterous an impossibility that I was sure some great mystery must lie behind it, and that I would participate in this mystery in the course of communion, on which my father seemed to place so high value. As was customary, a member of the church committee stood godfather to me. He was a nice, taciturn old man, a wheelwright, in whose workshop I had often stood, watching his skill with lathe and adze. Now he came, solemnly transformed by a frock coat and top hat, and took me to church, where my father in his familiar robes stood behind the altar and read prayers from the liturgy. On the white cloth covering the altar lay large trays filled with small pieces of bread. I could see that the bread came from our baker, whose baked goods were generally poor and flat in taste. From a pewter jug, wine was poured into a pewter cup. My father ate a piece of the bread, took a swallow of the wine. I knew the tavern from which it had come, and passed the cup to one of the old men. All was stiff, solemn, and it seemed to me uninterested. I looked on in suspense, but could not see or guess whether anything unusual was going on inside the old man. The atmosphere was the same as that of all other performances in church, baptisms, funerals, and so on. I had the impression that something was being performed here in the traditionally correct manner. My father, too, seemed to be chiefly concerned with going through it all according to rule, and it was part of this rule that the appropriate words were read or spoken with emphasis. There was no mention of the fact that it was now 1860 years since Jesus had died, whereas in all other memorial services the date was stressed. I saw no sadness and no joy, and felt that the feast was meager in every respect. Considering the extraordinary importance of the person whose memory was being celebrated, it did not compare at all with secular festivals. So one thing to note about this is that he noticed how the bread and wine are supposed to obviously be symbolic of, according to him, of the body and blood of Christ, but he could see how they literally, meaning not symbolically, came from the wares of the local place. So there's a kind of he was noticing the contradiction between the supposed symbolic meaning and the sort of literal or actual quote unquote truth. And to him, there seemed to be a contradiction. But it was also not only that, but also to do with atmosphere, that it was very dull and not living, not alive, but that it seemed to be being performed properly or correctly in the traditional sense, that it was more about rule rather than about spirit. So he goes on, suddenly my turn came. I ate the bread. It tasted flat, as I had expected. The wine, of which I took only the smallest sip, was thin and rather sour, plainly not of the best. Then came the final prayer, and the people went out, neither depressed nor illumined with joy, but with faces that said, "So that's that." I walked home with my father, intensely conscious that I was wearing a new black felt hat and a new black suit, which was already beginning to turn into a frock coat. It was a kind of lengthened jacket that spread out into two little wings over the seat, and between these was a slit with a pocket into which I could tuck a handkerchief, which seemed to me a grown-up, manly gesture. I felt socially elevated and by implication accepted into the society of men. So clearly there's the world of masculinity, the world of the church, the world of his father, the world of the men, the world of mainstream culture. They're all tied together and going together here. And obviously in Jung's experience, there's a contrast between the quite sort of meager feast of the experience of communion and his feeling of social elevation and acceptance into the society of men. He's happy about the latter, but disappointed in the former. And then he says, that day too, Sunday dinner was an unusually good one. I would be able to stroll about in my new suit all day, but otherwise I was empty and did not know what I was feeling. So here we notice that the feeling of acceptance and um, position, social elevation, uh, to use Fromm's phrase, they're coming from the having mode. They're shallow or hollow in a certain way. They're about appearances. They're about the surface of things. They're about the persona. But inside, quote, otherwise I was empty and did not know what I was feeling. Quote, only gradually, in the course of the following days, did it dawn on me that nothing had happened. I had reached the pinnacle of religious initiation, had expected something, I knew not what, to happen. He was, in fact, expecting something to happen. And nothing at all had happened. I knew that God could do stupendous things to me, things of fire and unearthly light, presumably because he'd read about that. But this ceremony contained no trace of God, not for me at any rate. So Jung is noticing that there seems to be a contradiction in his educated understanding of God at that point and the actual practical experience. There seemed to be a gross contrast between what he'd read about, let's say, the power of God and the actual experience of being in communion that he found to be very disappointing. As he said, this ceremony contained no trace of God, not for me at any rate. To be sure, there had been talk about him, but it had all amounted to no more than words. Among the others, I'd noticed nothing of the vast despair, the overpowering elation, an outpouring of grace, which for me constituted the essence of God. So again, here we have the impact of the Western religious education, which is about expressiveness and personality and feeling, and being impacted, being struck deeply to the core, being transformed. Quote, I noticed nothing of the vast despair, the overpowering elation, and the outpouring of grace, which for me constituted the essence of God. And so I don't think one could say that, like, that seems to me a fairly canonical expectation of the nature of God. It seems to me reasonable in light of the teachings to expect that, or to at least anticipate that would be possible. And I think also at a deeper level, the deep intuition that something like that is possible is in fact accurate in that it is possible. It is real. I'd say an experience like this one of communion is common, to say the least. He continues, I had observed no sign of communion, of union, becoming one with whom? With Jesus? Yet he was only a man who had died 1860 years ago. Why should a person become one with him? He was called, quote, Son of God, a demigod, therefore, like the Greek heroes. How then could an ordinary person become one with him? This was called the quote, Christian religion, but none of it had anything to do with God as I'd experienced him. So what Jung is pointing to is the claim that unity with Christ is possible doesn't seem logical. There's a question of how is that possible? And that the availability of an experience like that is not obvious from the teachings and seems again in stark contrast with the actual experience of communion. You could simply say that's not really communion, but it's kind of like, well, that's what is in the church, that's what's going on. And it seems, again, he said, but none of it had anything to do with God as I had experienced him. So it seems that Jung had already had religious experience at this point, and the more formal communion is sort of taking place in the context of that and shaping his expectation. So I think we can see here that already the influence of Jung's own personality, his intensely open nature, made such experience possible for him and shaped his understanding of the nature of God. As he said, this was called the Christian religion, but none of it had anything to do with God as I'd experienced him. On the other hand, it was quite clear that Jesus, the man, did have to do with God. He had despaired in Geth Gethsemane and on the cross. After having taught that God was a kind and loving Father, he too then must have seen the fearfulness of God. That I could understand, but what was the purpose of this wretched memorial service with the flat bread and the sour wine? So already, again, Jung, at this point, he has a sense that even though it might not be obvious how to become one with Jesus, it was clear that Jesus did have something to do with God to him because he did experience that despair that Jung had already described. After having taught the kind and loving nature of the Father. I just wonder whether that sort of that because there's a clear resonance with his description of Christ's personality at this point, as in I wonder he doesn't describe it though, so I can't exactly infer that, but it's kind of like the experience of emptiness that he describes going along with the social appearances. He said, I would be able to stroll about in my new suit all day, but otherwise I was empty and did not know what I was feeling. that feels to me similar in some way to the despair of Christ in the face of after having taught that God was a kind and loving Father. It's not exactly the same, though. Jesus seemed to have the experience that God was, in fact, fearful, and the despair followed from that recognition in contrast to his teachings. Whereas with Jung, he seemed to experience that his father was good-natured but hollow, and this left him feeling disappointed and empty. In any case, his understanding of Jesus and that Jesus did have to do with God, even though it was difficult to become like him or not clear how to become like him. His understanding of Jesus came about because he was able to recognize the despair in him and the contrast between the experience of God that Jesus had, that of his fearful nature, and the teachings that Christ gave of his kind and loving qualities. And Jung said he too then must have seen the fearfulness of God, which implies that Jung had already experienced something impressive that it struck him as quite fearful of God. So it's already quite particular. It seems that Jung is sort of prone to that particular kind of experience from a very early age. Who can divine the meaning or reason for such a condition? That I can understand, but what was the purpose of this wretched memorial service with the flat bread and the sour wine? Slowly, I came to understand that this communion had been a fatal experience for me. It had proved hollow, more than that. It had proved to be a total loss. I knew that I would never again be able to participate in this ceremony. Quote, why, that is not religion at all, I thought. It is an absence of God. The church is a place I should not go to. It is not life which is there, but death. So the impact of this experience is clear. It had the reverse, the opposite of the effect that it's, I would say, intended to have. As he said, communion had been a fatal experience for me. Quote, I was seized with the most vehement pity for my father. All at once, I understood the tragedy of his profession and his life. He was struggling with a death whose existence he could not admit. It's just there's something here of obviously he's talking about the father in a literal context, but as a result of our, millennia long Christian inheritance, the father is unconsciously projected onto the capital F father. So when Jung says, I was seized with the most vehement pity for my father, I can read this, I think, coherently as there being unconscious pity for the God who is absent, not just for the literal father who acts religiously, even though God is manifestly not there, but pity actually for that father, that God who is not there. And so this allows us to reread the passage. All at once, I understood the tragedy of his profession and his life, namely that of God. Quote, he was struggling with a death whose existence he could not admit, namely his own death. Quote, an abyss had opened between him and me, and I saw no possibility of ever bridging it, for it was infinite in extent. God was manifestly not there, and that not there-ness becomes an abyss that separates Jung from God himself, at least understood in this way. Quote, I could not plunge my dear and generous father, who in so many matters left me to myself and had never tyrannized over me. I could not plunge my dear and generous father into that despair and sacrilege which were necessary for an experience of divine grace. It's obviously a bit of a stretch to interpret it that way, but I just thought it would be interesting. So there's a way that the equivalent of plunging God into the despair and sacrilege would be in the self-recognition of the absence of divinity in such a place, the self-awareness of that, and as that. Anyway, I won't continue on that theme. He says, only God could do that. I had no right to. It would be inhuman. So he's not going to point it out to his father. He's not going to plunge him into the despair and sacrilege which were necessary for an experience of divine grace. He's going to let his father live his contradictory life, feeling that he had no right to and that it would be inhuman. God is not human, I thought. That is his greatness, that nothing human impinges on him. He is kind and terrible both at once, and is therefore a great peril from which everyone naturally tries to save himself. People cling one-sidedly to his love and goodness, for fear they will fall victim to the tempter and destroyer. Jesus too had noticed that and had therefore taught, quote, lead us not into temptation. So this passage goes to reinforce Jung's pre-existing notion of the duplicity of God, that God has both right and left hands. This is a Yahwistic impression of God, very much not the Christian notion. Jung's notion already at this point is that the Christian perception of the love, the goodness, the kindness is something that is an image that we define, that we cling to out of fear, and fear that we fall victim to the other side. And he feels that Jesus also noticed that. He said, my sense of union with the church and with the human world, so far as I knew it, was shattered. I had, so it seemed to me, suffered the greatest defeat of my life. The religious outlook which I imagined constituted my sole meaningful relation with the universe had disintegrated. The religious outlook which I imagined constituted my sole meaningful relation with the universe had disintegrated. I could no longer participate in the general faith, but found myself involved in something inexpressible, in my secret, which I could share with no one. It was terrible, and this was the worst of it, vulgar and ridiculous also, a diabolical mockery. So I mean, this is the desert that we're plunged into when we leave the city. You know, it's when you crush a cathedral like that with the truth that it didn't work and that there was no life there. There was no divinity there. And that was manifestly obvious. And that God was clearly duplicitous in nature and terrible as well as good. There's very much the nihilism that follows. It's the emptiness, it's hollowness. It's a sense of being shattered. It's a sense of defeat. It's a sense of absurdity. a ridiculousness, and also vulgarity that one that sense of vulgarity and ridiculousness, that mockery, that comes from the necessity to then participate in the absence that follows upon the recognition of the death of God. We're plunged into all of that. As he said, I had, so it seemed to me, suffered the greatest defeat of my life. The religious outlook which I imagined constituted my sole meaningful relation with the universe had disintegrated. I could no longer participate in the general faith, but found myself involved in something inexpressible. And so we drop down into this deeper level of our being, which is about participation, which is about our actual lived experience, difficult as it may be. When the collective institutional form is ousted as a lie, this is what follows. The difficulty of being with the truth. I began to ponder, what must one think of God? I had not invented that thought about God in the cathedral, still less the dream that had befallen me at the age of 3, which we haven't heard of yet. A stronger will than mine had imposed both on me. Had nature been responsible? But nature was nothing other than the will of the Creator. Nor did it help to accuse the devil, for he too was a creature of God. God alone was real, an annihilating fire and an indescribable grace. What about the failure of communion to affect me? Was that my own failure? I had prepared for it in all earnestness, had hoped for an experience of grace and illumination, and nothing had happened. God had been absent. For God's sake, I now found myself cut off from the church and from my father's and everybody else's faith, insofar as they all represented the Christian religion. I was an outsider. This knowledge filled me with a sadness which was to overshadow all the years until the time I entered the university. I began looking in my father's relatively modest library, which in those days seemed impressive to me, for books that would tell me what was known about God. At first, I found only the traditional conceptions, but not what I was seeking, a writer who thought independently. At last, I hit upon Biedermann's Christlich Dogmatik, published in 1869. Here, apparently, was a man who thought for himself, who worked out his own views. I learned from him that religion was a spiritual act, consisting in man's establishing his own relationship to God. I disagreed with that, for I understood religion as something that God did to me. It was an act on his part, to which I must simply yield, for he was the stronger. There's a couple of things already all through here. Jung is clearly trying to understand and integrate his experiences. The experiences seem to come to him, and then he received them in a certain way, and his search for understanding came about after that fact. resonates very deeply. In any case, his the independence of his religious position after his experiences and after the experience of communion and so on, and being cut off from everyone else's faith, that was what led him to seek for people who were also independent thinkers. So there's something about the general view of things which seemed lacking. I'm just keeping in mind the particularity. It's already like a very particular conception of the, because again, the guy said, I learned from him that religion was a spiritual act consisting in man's establishing his own relationship to God. And in a way, that's true. It's just that the relationship is characterized by the quality of yielding, needing to yield. That is a kind of relationship. It's it just has a yin quality rather than a yang, because sort of seeking creative, initiating quality. Anyway, he goes on. My religion recognized no human relationship to God. For how could anyone relate to something so little known as God? I must know more about God in order to establish a relationship to him. That's interesting. So for Jung, it seems that what he was receiving could not be considered to be a part of a relationship. There seemed to be a base level of familiarity and seemingly reciprocity and mutual knowledge that is required as a precondition for genuine relationship. So it seems this implies that the experiences that he had already received, he would not consider to be part of a relationship with God. In Biedermann's chapter on the nature of God, I found that God showed himself to be, quote, a personality to be conceived after the analogy of the human ego, the unique, utterly supramundane ego who embraces the entire cosmos. Such a classically Western idea, anyway. As far as I knew the Bible, this definition seemed to fit. God has a personality and is the ego of the universe, just as I myself am the ego of my psychic and physical being. So again, this is like there's a sort of correspondence here, and there's an Atman Brahman thing going on where, like, by understanding the positionality of one's own ego, one is able to understand God in similar terms. It's definitely an understanding. It's so particular. Anyway, but here I encountered a formidable obstacle. Personality, after all, surely signifies character. Now, character is one thing and not another. That is to say, it involves certain specific attributes. But if God is everything, how can he still possess a distinguishable character? On the other hand, if he does have a character, he can only be the ego of a subjective limited world. Moreover, what kind of character or what kind of personality does he have? Everything depends on that. For unless one knows the answer, one cannot establish a relationship to him. That's so interesting, all of this. I mean, I think I would have to disagree with the last point. I think one can establish a relationship with something that one does not know the character of. I think relation can at least be opened. but I certainly get what he means. And the point about distinguishable character, there's a way that personality, it seems to be, it's secondary in some way. It's kind of derivative or not quote unquote the truth of who we are, which is why the point stands. How can he have a distinguishable character if he is everything? It seems like the answer in Jung's own later terms would be that the way that he appears is by way of compensation. So he appears in the guise of whatever we do not include or allow within our personality, within our ego, and thus is an expression of totality or wholeness, while also showing a certain distinguishable character derived in a sense that is opposite or compensating our own. Anyway, I felt the strongest resistances to imagining God by analogy with my own ego. That seemed to me boundlessly arrogant, if not downright blasphemous. My ego was, in any case, difficult enough for me to grasp. In the first place, I was aware that it consisted of two contradictory aspects, number one and number two. And these voices that emerge very early on in Jung become later on the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths in the Red Book, which are really, really important to him. Explored, for example, in great detail in Peter Kingsley, Catafalque. So part of the reason for his resistance to imagining God by analogy with his own ego is because it was not only hard to grasp his own ego, but that it seemed to be it consisted of two contradictory aspects, the number one and number two aspects. And then he goes on, second, in both its aspects, my ego was extremely limited, subject to all possible self-deceptions and errors, moods, emotions, passions, and sins. It suffered far more defeats than triumphs, was childish, vain, self-seeking, defiant, in need of love, covetous, unjust, sensitive, lazy, irresponsible, and so on. To my sorrow, it lacked many of the virtues and talents I admired and envied in others. How could this be the analogy according to which we were to imagine the nature of God? Eagerly, I looked up the other characteristics of God. Eagerly, I looked up the other characteristics of God and found them all listed in the way familiar to me from my instruction for confirmation. I found that according to Article 172, quote, the most immediate expression of the supramundane nature of God is one, negative, his invisibility to men, and two, positive, his dwelling in heaven, etc. This was disastrous, for at once there rushed to my mind the blasphemous vision which God, directly or indirectly, via the devil, had imposed on my will. So again, the first quality that he found was that God showed himself to be a personality to be conceived of after the analogy of the human ego. And Jung finds this very difficult in light of the many um, the qualities that he regards as sort of sorrowful, that he lacks many of the virtues and talents. So in light of the limitations and shortcomings of the ego, it seems unjust and wrong to compare God in that way by analogy. And then he finds that the further characteristics that are described in these negative, meaning invisibility, and positive, dwelling in heaven terms, they give rise to this uh, blasphemous thoughts that he was already having. So it indicates to me that there's something inadequate about that understanding, that it results in the the expression or the impulse or the instinct that gave rise to the situation in which he's currently embedded. So it's a kind of this definition kind of calls him toward regression, and his mind reacts with like a no, that's not the way to go. And so then we're still left with the question of how are we supposed to understand the nature of God? And then he goes on. Article 183 informed me that, quote, God's supramundane nature with regard to the moral world consists in, quote, his justice, which is not merely judicial, but is also an expression of his holy being. I had hoped that this paragraph would say something about God's dark aspects, which were giving me so much trouble. His vindictiveness, his dangerous wrathfulness, his incomprehensible conduct toward the creatures his omnipotence had made, whose inadequacies he must know by virtue of that same omnipotence, and whom, moreover, it pleased him to lead astray, or at least to test, even though he knew in advance the outcome of his experiments. I may regard all this as projection. I mean, but I can also understand it as reasonable. I mean, so the reality was that he had these experiences and he had to try and make sense of them. And it seemed that they were characteristic of a nature that was vindictive, wrathful, involving incomprehensible conduct, and like overtones of sadism. And it's like I think there's a way that those are kind of imputations of character, which, well, they probably seem logical and reasonable in assessment of one's character, of a character. Hmm. So it seems like what I'm trying to draw here, there's something there where how do I try and get at that? So there's a way that if one's really in touch with God as the highest good, God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, then one has to have the ultimate faith, as in Job, that even in the face of this vindictiveness and wrathfulness and so on, that there is a reason and that there's a plan, and we're only given the tests that we can handle and like that. And that's definitely a hard ask, but I can understand such I can understand such burdens as sort of necessary or inevitable, or that we're asked to bear them. I can't necessarily understand them as good, as deriving something that is good. It more has the quality of isness. It's just what it is. It's what everyone is given tasks and challenges. And I can understand why someone may regard a character behind such difficult experiences as vindictive and wrathful and so on. But I think it really does seem to derive from this comparison from the ego to the nature of God. And I think it's a little tricky here because I feel that there is something valuable about this personalizing of God. There is this kind of correspondence, the microcosm macrocosm thing, and there does seem to be a creative intelligence that constitutes all things. But I don't know that one could say that it exactly has a character in. I think it would be more true to say that character is imputed to it by us. it seems to me that the conception of God and the conception of a God having character, and namely a particular character, and that one is in relation with that figure, that all of that lies within life. So there's a way that I feel that this personalizing of God in comparison to the ego, or by analogy with the ego, is somewhat reductive and is making God appear to be rather small. So there's a way that I feel that Jung's assessment of the character of God in this case, derived from his experiences, is strongly influenced by the sense of comparing the character of God, that God has a character, that can be understood. Like, I think it's possible that God is not that sort of phenomena. But I can understand why, if we follow someone like Biederman, for example, who's saying that it is, God shows himself to be quite a personality to be conceived after the analogy of the human ego. Well, this is definitely showing up in what Jung is getting at. It kind of comes down to the question, what is God? And that's a good question, you know? Anyway, certainly Jung experienced powerful, overwhelming, and seemingly involuntary experiences, powerful experiences that seem to come from a will greater than his own, and that he felt were reasonable to characterize as involving vindictiveness and wrathfulness and so on, and that he attributed them as coming from God, or at least indirectly, and that the questioning about God's character comes about as a result of all of that. And fair enough, in the light of the evident failure and inadequacy of the mainstream collective faith, it seems rather short shrift to simply point him back to, read the book of Job again. It's kind of like it seems a little bit hollow in light of the perspective that he's already shown to us. The reality of the inadequacy of what the tradition actually was able to show up with. As he said, what indeed was God's character? What would we say of a human personality who behaved in this manner? I did not dare to think this question out to its conclusion. The conclusion would be that it's, dark tetrad, cruel, narcissistic, sadistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian would be the other one. And I mean, to me, that would be the logical and reasonable conclusion if so. I think for me, what this calls into question is the notion of comparing God's character to that of a human character. And I think Jung was already pointing to the difficulty of that when he was pointing to the somewhat lacking aspects, the limited, very limited aspects of his own character. So I feel that it would be a fair conclusion to suggest that God is not a phenomena that, like, it's very I would say it's very tempting to project the qualities of human character upon God. And that can lead to difficulty, to say the least, in relation with that figure. So then we're if we can notice that, then we see how Jung may get stuck in that or something, and then we're left with the question again of, well, how can we know the nature of God if he's not to be conceived after the analogy of a human ego? And I mean, is the obvious answer not derived from experience? Because then we can say, oh, you can read about him in the Bible, but look, a lot of people don't find that an adequate answer to the question. So I think that person of faith is in a position to say, we think that you can find out by reading the Bible, as in we've decided that, we humans. Which leads us back to the same question. What indeed was God's character? What would we say of a human personality who behaved in this manner? I did not dare to think this question out to its conclusion. And then I read that God, quote, although sufficient unto himself and needing nothing outside himself, had created the world, quote, out of his satisfaction, and, quote, as a natural world has filled it with his goodness, and as a moral world desires to fill it with his love. At first I pondered over the perplexing word satisfaction. He created the world out of his satisfaction. Satisfaction with what or with whom? Obviously with the world, for he had looked upon his work and called it good. But it was just this that I had never understood. Certainly the world is immeasurably beautiful, but it is quite as horrible. In a small village in the country where there are few people and nothing much happens, old age, disease, and death are experienced more intensely, in greater detail, and more nakedly than elsewhere. Although I was not yet 16 years old, I had seen a great deal of the reality of the life of man and beast. And in church and school, I had heard enough of the sufferings and corruption of the world. God could at most have felt satisfaction with paradise, but then he himself had taken good care that the glory of paradise should not last too long by planting in it that poisonous serpent, the devil. Had he taken satisfaction in that too? So again, the concern is already that the the qualities that are attributed to God, according to the sort of reputable sources, don't seem to make sense. It does seem, does it not seem one-sided to look at the whole world and simply regard it good? There is a certain point of view. I mean, I'm thinking of the Ramdas video, Ramdas, It's All Perfect, about a 13-minute video. And yes, there's a kind of equanimous perspective from which, yes, it's all perfect, just the way it is. And I find that extremely problematic. And I won't say anything more about that. It seems to me bypassing. It seems to me, I don't know. And so the conclusion that I mean that what's implied to Jung is that there's a sort of illogicality that why should God be satisfied with the way that the world is? Why should he call it good when there's obviously so much evil and suffering? This seems to call into question God's character, God's nature, given the obviousness of the evil and suffering and old age and death and so on, and corruption and difficulty. And then again, it's a deep question of like why did he put the snake in the garden? Was that also satisfying? Was that also good? Quote, I felt certain that Biederman did not mean this, but was simply babbling on in that mindless way that characterized religious instruction, not even aware that he was writing nonsense. As I saw it, I was not at all it was not at all unreasonable to suppose that God, for all that he probably did not. Sorry, it's a long sentence. It says, as I saw it, as I saw it, it was not at all unreasonable to suppose that God, for all that he probably did not feel any such cruel satisfaction in the unmerited sufferings of man and beast, had nevertheless intended to create a world of contradictions, in which one creature devoured another, and life meant simply being born to die. The wonderful harmonies of natural law looked to me more like a chaos tamed by fearful effort. And the eternal starry firmament, with its predetermined orbits, seemed plainly an accumulation of random bodies without order or meaning. For no one could really see the constellations people spoke about. They were mere arbitrary configurations. So this is the very roots of the notion of projection. It's the romantic notion that we express meaning and impute meaning to the world, that it's not inherently there. The later Jung starts to break out of this, but it's very much here. So he steps back a bit from regarding God's character as being cruel. Maybe it's probable that he didn't feel cruel satisfaction in this unmerited suffering, but that he did in fact intend to create a world of contradictions, such as the one that we see. And this calls into question the notion that it is good, the assumption that it is good. And he says, I either did not see or gravely doubted that God filled the natural world with his goodness. This apparently was another of those points which must not be reasoned about, but must be believed. In fact, if God is the highest good, why is the world, his creation, so imperfect, so corrupt, so pitiable? That's a good question. That brings up the point that if one does not see that God fills the natural world with his goodness, how could one come to see such a thing? How could it be possible to take up the perspective by which one can see that the world is in fact filled with the goodness of the Lord? Um, and especially in light of the experiences that Jung already had, that had the character that he was describing, that would seem to me profoundly difficult, profoundly like near impossible to come to that perspective. And it would need to be I mean, part of this is a product of modernity. So the idea being, hey, if you're living in a tribal context with uh, proper eldership and people that are capable of answering questions and helping one to understand difficult and deep experiences of a young person, that one doesn't need to draw the conclusions that were drawn here. But I think Jung, like everyone else, is very much a product of modernity. And the whole point is that we don't have all of that structure. That's not there. We're left to ourselves and we're left to the good graces of what remains of the institutions, which Jung found sorely lacking in light of his experiences. It thereby becomes virtually impossible for him to feel that God filled the natural world with his goodness. This would seem to be an absurdity, especially in light of the, as he says, of the faith. This apparently was another of those points which must not be reasoned about, but must be believed. And to any thinking person, to any modern person, that isn't, it's not reasonable, which I guess is the whole point. But that's, I'm not intending that to be pejorative. It's just, yeah, I mean, we do rely on reason. So then it becomes about, is it possible to rely on reason and also have faith in a God which is good? Or does our dependence on reason obviate the notion of a God who's good? That's a good question. Anyway, in fact, if God is the highest good, why is the world, his creation, so imperfect, so corrupt, so pitiable? Quite obviously, it has been infected and thrown into confusion by the devil, I thought. But the devil, too, was a creature of God. I had read up on the devil. He seemed to be highly important, after all. There's obviously the question there of why Jung was fascinated with such a character. He does seem to be important in sort of excusing everything that's wrong, though. I again opened Biedermann's book on Christian dogmatics and looked for the answer to this burning question. What were the reasons for suffering, imperfection, and evil? I could find nothing. That finished it for me. This weighty tome on dogmatics was nothing but fancy drivel, where still it was a fraud or a specimen of uncommon stupidity whose sole aim was to obscure the truth. I was disillusioned and even indignant, and once more seized with pity for my father, who had fallen victim to this mumbo jumbo. And, I think um, the highest quality theologians may well have responses to this, but part of the point is that by virtue of the structure of the institution itself, those responses are not easy to find. They're not easily available. Like Jung, as an intelligent teenager, I think is well within his rights to want to know and expect someone to be able to answer. And I mean, he did look for an answer. You could say, oh, you have to look harder and find the doctrines that could explain this. But it's kind of like, well, no one was there to help him do that. And that's maybe exactly the point. There's an absence, a lack of answers, and in fact, answers which are not adequate to the depth of the questioning. Jung would be asked in this place to sort of hold his judgment in reserve in the faith that there are, in fact, better answers somewhere. And I think it's reasonable to see that as a tall order. Although I think it's also reasonable to see that Jung does jump to the conclusion that it's all mumbo jumbo. But I don't know if he said that it's all mumbo jumbo. He said this mumbo jumbo, as in that which he'd already read. Anyway, but somewhere and at some time there must have been people who sought the truth as I was doing, who thought rationally and did not wish to deceive themselves and others and deny the sorrowful reality of the world. It was about this time that my mother, or rather her number two personality, apparently his mother had two personalities also, suddenly and without preamble said, "You must read Goethe's Faust one of these days." We had a handsome edition of Goethe, and I picked out Faust. It poured into my soul like a miraculous balm. Here at last, I thought, is someone who takes the devil seriously and even concludes a blood pact with him, with the adversary who has the power to frustrate God's plan to make a perfect world. I regretted Faust's behavior, for to my mind, he should not have been so one-sided and easily tricked. He should have been cleverer and also more moral. How childish he was to gamble away his soul so frivolously. Faust was plainly a bit of a windbag. I had the impression that the weight of the drama and its significance lay chiefly on the side of Mephistopheles. It would not have grieved me if Faust's soul had gone to hell. He deserved it. I did not like the idea of the cheated devil at the end, for after all, Mephistopheles had been anything but a stupid devil. Had been anything but a stupid devil, and it was contrary to logic for him to be tricked by silly little angels. Mephistopheles seemed to me cheated in quite a different sense. He had not received his promised rights because Faust, that somewhat characterless fellow, had carried his swindle through right into the hereafter, into death. There, admittedly, his puerility came to light, but as I saw it, he did not deserve the initiation into the great mysteries. I would have given him a taste of purgatorial fires. The real problem, it seemed to me, lay with Mephistopheles, whose whole figure made the deepest impression on me, and who, I vaguely sensed, had a relationship to the mystery of the mothers. I think that says, at any rate, Mephistopheles and the great initiation at the end remained for me a wonderful and mysterious experience on the fringes of my conscious world. We can see here that some of the what we could call limitations in Jung's character that he was describing earlier. And does this go along with the loss of faith that he was describing? Possibly. Quote, I would have given him a taste of purgatorial fires. I mean, fair enough. It's human. You don't have to impute the influence of the devil, you know. And I also think it's reasonable to like if because there's a way that Mephistopheles is a thinking guy. Like the whole point of Lucifer in a sense that is that he's the cold, calculating intellect. But Jung here is drawn to question and to reason, to ask. And that is not inherently a Luciferian quality. At last, I had found confirmation that there were or had been people who saw evil and its universal power, and more important, the mysterious role it played in delivering man from darkness and suffering. Okay, here we have a very interesting idea. Jung got a lot from reading Faust. He found that there are people who, he found in Faust that there are people who notice evil, who see its power, and who understand that it actually plays a role from delivering us from darkness and suffering. That being evil in the form of Mephistopheles and the deliverance coming in the form of Faust. To that extent, Goethe became, in my eyes, a prophet, but I could not forgive him for having dismissed Mephistopheles by mere trick, by a bit of jiggery pokery. For me, that was too theological, too frivolous and irresponsible, and I was deeply sorry that Goethe too had fallen for those cunning devices by which evil is rendered innocuous. Okay, well, I will try and get over the page here. In reading the drama, I discovered that Faust had been a philosopher of sorts, and although he turned away from philosophy, he had obviously learned from it a certain receptivity to the truth. Hitherto, I'd heard virtually nothing of philosophy, and now a new hope dawned. Perhaps I thought there were philosophers who had grappled with these questions and could shed light on them for me. So he's really looking for an answer, you know. Since there were no philosophers in my father's library, they were suspect because they thought. I had to content myself with Krug's General Dictionary of the Philosophical Sciences, second edition, 1832. I plunged forthwith into the article on God. To my discontent, it began with the etymology of the word God, which it said incontestably derived from good and signified the ens summum or perfectismus. Sorry, perfectissimum. Either the all or the perfect, I don't know, anyway, Latin. The existence of God could not be proved, it continued, nor the innateness of the idea of God. The latter, however, could exist a priori in man, if not in actuality, at any rate potentiality. The innateness of the idea of God could exist a priori in man, if not in actuality, at any rate potentially. In any case, our intellectual powers must, quote, already be developed to a certain degree before they are capable of engendering so sublime an idea. So this way that what this is claiming here is that obviously there's the etymological derivation from good, which he's going to take issue with, and then there's the idea that the existence of God can't be proved, but the innateness of the idea of God seems obvious to this writer that he's talking about. And there's also the notion that our intellectual powers, quote, have to be developed to a certain degree in order to come up with such an idea of God, which also would him, I gather, seem to him it would seem contradictory, given we're not supposed to think, apparently. As he said, this explanation astounded me beyond measure. What's wrong with these philosophers? I wondered. Evidently, they know of God only by hearsay. The theologians are different in this respect, at any rate. At least they are sure that God exists, even though they make contradictory statements about him. This lexicographer, Krug, expresses himself in so involved a manner that it's easy to see he would like to assert that he is already sufficiently convinced of God's existence. Why then doesn't he say so outright? Why does he pretend? As if he really thought that we engender the idea of God. And to do so, we must first have reached a certain level of development. Quote, so far as I knew, even the savages wandering naked in their jungles had such ideas of God. And they were certainly not philosophers who sat down to engender an idea of God. I never engendered any idea of God either. Of course, God cannot be proved. For how could, say, a clothes moth that eats Australian wool prove to other moths that Australia exists? God's existence does not depend on our proofs. How had I arrived at my certainty about God? I was told all sorts of things about him, yet I could believe none. I could believe nothing. None of it convinced me. None of it convinced me. That was not where my idea came from. In fact, it was not an idea at all. That is, not something thought out. It was not like imagining something and thinking it out and afterward believing it. For example, all that about Lord Jesus was always suspect to me, and I never really believed it, although it was impressed upon me far more than God, who was usually only hinted at in the background. Why have I come to take God for granted? Why do these philosophers pretend that God is an idea, a kind of arbitrary assumption, which they can engender or not, when it is perfectly plain that he exists, as plain as a brick that falls on your head? So I would summarize all this by saying that Jung sort of noticing the incongruence between the idea of talking about or defining or philosophizing over the nature of God and the raw experience of the reality. That seems like something that maybe can't be philosophized about. So he says, suddenly I understood that God was, for me at least, one of the most certain and immediate of experiences. After all, I didn't invent that horrible image about the cathedral. On the contrary, it was forced on me, and I was compelled, with the utmost cruelty, to think it. And afterward, that inexpressible feeling of grace came to me. I had no control over these things. I came to the conclusion that there must be something the matter with these philosophers. For they had the curious notion that God was a kind of hypothesis that could be discussed. I also found it extremely unsatisfying that the philosophers offered no opinions or explanations about the dark deeds of God. These, it seemed to me, merited special attention and consideration from philosophy, since they constituted a problem, which I gathered was rather a hard one for the theologians. All the greater was my disappointment to discover that the philosophers had apparently never even heard of it. We're almost done here. I therefore passed on to the next topic that interested me, the article on the devil. If we read, if I read, we conceived of the devil as originally evil, we would become entangled in patent contradictions. That is to say, we would fall into dualism. Therefore, we would do better to assume, this is in the writing that he's reading, therefore, we would do better to assume that the devil was originally created a good being, but it had been corrupted by his pride. However, as the author of the article pointed out, and I was glad to see this point made, this hypothesis presupposed the evil it was attempting to explain, namely pride. For the rest, he continued, the origin of evil was unexplained and inexplicable, which meant to me, like the theologians, he does not want to think about it. The article on evil and its origin proved equally unilluminating. The account I have given here summarizes trains of thought and developments of ideas, which, broken by long intervals, extended over several years. They went on exclusively in my number 2 personality, later becoming the Spirit of the Depths in the Red Book, and were strictly private. I used my father's library for these researches, secretly and without asking his permission. In the intervals, personality number 1 openly read all the novels of Goethe and German translations of the classic English novels. I also began reading German literature, concentrating on those classics which school, with its needlessly laborious explanations of the obvious, had not spoiled for me. I read vastly and planlessly, drama, poetry, history, and later natural science. Reading was not only interesting, but provided a welcome and beneficial distraction from the preoccupations of personality number two, which in increasing measure were leading me to depressions. No doubt. For everywhere in the realm of religious questions, I encountered only locked doors. And if ever one door should chance to open, I was disappointed by what lay behind it. Other people all seemed to have totally different concerns. I felt completely alone with my certainties. More than ever, I wanted someone to talk with, but nowhere did I find a point of contact. On the contrary, I sensed in others an estrangement, a distrust, an apprehension which robbed me of speech. That's exactly what I feel. But everywhere in the realm of religious questions, I encountered only locked doors. And if ever one door should chance to open, I was disappointed by what lay behind it. Other people all seemed to have totally different concerns. I felt completely alone with my certainties. More than ever, I wanted someone to talk with, but nowhere did I find a point of contact. On the contrary, I sensed in others an estrangement, a distrust, an apprehension which robbed me of speech. That too depressed me. I did not know what to make of it. Why has no one had experiences similar to mine? Why has no one had experiences similar to mine? I wondered. Why is there nothing about it in scholarly books? Am I the only one who has had such experiences? Why should I be the only one? It never occurred to me that I might be crazy, for the light and darkness of God seemed to me facts that could be understood, even though they oppressed my feelings. So that was 27 through 36. And I think this is long enough, so I'm going to break it up and do the other part from MDR in a subsequent episode. Well, doesn't get easier, but at least I can see where he's coming from.